Welcome to the 16th edition of the Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol, Banega Swasth India at the front lawn. We are delighted to introduce the next session, The Drama of Ideas, How Theatre and Philosophy Have Always Been Intertwined. Most philosophy has rejected the theatre, denouncing it as a place of illusion or moral decay. The theatre, in turn, has rejected philosophy, insisting that drama deals in actions and not ideas. Challenging both views, Martin Puchner and Amia Srinivasan show that theatre and philosophy have been crucially intertwined from the start. Together, they discover scores of dramatic adaptations of Platonic dialogues and how Platonism goes beyond the reigning philosophies of the body, of materialism, and of cultural relativism. Our first speaker for today, Martin Puchner, a professor of English at Harvard University, is a prize-winning author whose books range from philosophy to the arts, including the best-selling The Written Word and his memoir, The Language of Thieves. His new book, Culture, The Story of Us, will be published in early 2023. Please join me in welcoming Martin Puchner. Our second speaker is Amia Srinivasan, is the Chichele Professor of Social and Political Theory at All Souls College, Oxford. She is the author of The Right to Sex, a Sunday Times bestseller. Ladies and gentlemen, Martin Puchner and Amia Srinivasan in conversation, The Drama of Ideas, How Theatre and Philosophy Have Always Been Intertwined.
Hi, Martin.
Hi, Heidi.
So I think we should begin with a warning to the audience, which is that we are not planning on performing on stage. There's no theatrical performance. There's no Brechtian breaking of the fourth wall going to happen. So if you'd like to leave and find another session, we won't be unhappy. But we are going to talk about the relationship of philosophy and theatre, two things that are close to both of our hearts, in ways that I think will come out during our discussion. So Martin, I thought we could begin by going to this chapter in your most recent book, Culture, about which you've been speaking earlier today. And we know, or those of us who are familiar with Plato, know that the banishment of the poets is crucial to his political philosophy. So for those of you who don't know, Plato evicts the poets from his ideal city in his most political work, important political work, The Republic. And there's a huge amount of debate about why the poets can't have a place in an ideal political space. But what you do is talk about the rejection of the theatre for Plato and why that was such a vexed issue given his own theatrical entanglement. So maybe you could just set the scene for us a little.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for that. And the first biographer of Plato, Diogenes Laertius, and writing admittedly a few hundred years after Plato, has this intriguing anecdote, namely that Plato himself started out as a playwright, much like you did, I believe, also, and that he was a choragus, that means a leader of the chorus, so he was really immersed in the theater world of Athens, and the theater festival, of course, was part of an important part of the city's civic life as well, and that he was waylaid by Socrates, and that somehow at the end of that interaction with Socrates, Plato would take his tragedy and burn it. And so, on the one hand, this is sort of the scene of the fact that either you become a playwright or you become a philosopher. You can't be both. But also what always intrigued me more about it is that Plato himself had this background in theater, started out as a playwright. And I think that becomes interesting when we recognize that the form of philosophy it took for Plato was to write dramatic dialogues. That means he used some historical figures, but he also invented figures. All his dialogues are set in a particular scene, and that matters. There's a lot of interest in the interaction and the emotions. It's not just an exchange of arguments. So that in some sense, he continued to write plays, albeit in a very different mode.
Right, so I think of Plato's rejection both of the poets and of the theater. By that, we don't just mean the fact that he burnt this play and chose to become professionally a philosopher instead. We also mean his evisceration of the theater on philosophical grounds in his work, and of poetry as modes that are fundamentally deceptive, misleading, take people away from the truth, therefore also morally corrupting. I've always taken all of that to be a bit of a lie in an important sense. There's an important sense in which Plato remains a poet, remains a dramatist. There's the dialogue form, right? And it's not just, two people speaking. It's two people speaking dramatically. Things happen in these dialogues. People get upset. People get thrown out of the conversation. Drunken men enter. Flute girls are sent out. They take place in a particular setting at a particular moment. They're exciting and thrilling to read, just like the best plays are. But also we can just think about how many theatrical devices Plato also uses. So for example, something like the allegory of the cave, which is very important for Plato. It's the basic idea that it's the kind of metaphor, the theatrical metaphor he uses to explain how most of us all start out just living in a world of illusion where we aren't in touch with the nature of fundamental reality. This, of course, will be very resonant with an Indian audience, as if we are in a cave looking at shadows cast by basically a puppet show, objects being moved along a wall against a fire. And we are supposed to come out of that cave and see reality. And the contradiction, the paradox is that for Plato, theater and the representative arts in general are antithetical to coming to understand the nature of reality. But he can't avoid using the representational arts, poetry, and the theater in describing his philosophy.
Right. No, I think that's beautifully put. And so there's a real paradox here, or Plato being tied to these techniques that he disdains in some way, and that he remains tied to this dialogic form. And what's interesting, that this is in some sense the beginning of Greek philosophy, this struggle with theater. And what always intrigued me is that if we move away from Greek or Western philosophy for a moment, and we go to other parts of the world, you almost see similar patterns. I'm thinking, for example, of the Buddhist sutras, that are also not just a treatise or like a lecture, but it's conversations. There's a setting. There's questions from students and dialogue and interaction. And if you go to China, it's the same thing with the Analects of Confucius. There's interaction. There's an attention to how we interact with each other. There's an attention to how Confucius eats, his living arrangements. The 10th book of the Analects has no dialogue at all. It's just about observing of customs and habits. And so you have these different intellectual, philosophical traditions that all start with these dialogue-like texts. And I find that really intriguing.
And do you, as someone who studied philosophy as a student, do you have a view as to why dialogues are attractive for philosophers, or historically have been? I think it's very notable, we've spoken about this, that contemporary philosophers, at least in the academy, especially in the Anglophone world, but I think it's pretty robust, don't use the dialogue form anymore, right? They write academic articles that are basically modeled on scientific articles. Is that a loss?
On some level, I think it is a loss, and it's interesting to look at the exceptions. Iris Murdoch is a philosopher in the Anglophone world who's, of course, written novels, but also dialogues. Martha Nussbaum has tried her hands at dialogues. They don't usually take off. It's not their major form, but it's interesting that these philosophers are try to tap into that long tradition. But why is there this dialogic moment at the origin? I'm not sure. I've sort of one theory has to do with this old term, the axial age, that Karl Jaspers coined, and he observed that within a few hundred years of each other, you have figures like Socrates, like the Buddha, like Confucius, like Jesus, that pop up in these literate societies, but they themselves don't write a single word. Right? They could have written, but their students write down their thoughts. Plato writes down Socrates, students of the Buddha write down the sutras, and so on and so forth. So maybe the dialogue is a form of preserving some of that live, theatrical, let's say, interaction that seems so crucial to philosophy, and that we have lost in writing. Though you as a philosopher can maybe talk about, it seems to me that this dialogic form still exists in the kind of oral disputation tradition of analytic philosophy, doesn't it?
Yes, it absolutely does. I'll get back to that in 1 second. I just want to pick on what you were saying, Martin, a moment ago, because I do think that's right. I mean, if you read Plato's dialogues, the protagonist, the star, the central character of almost all of them is his teacher Socrates, who is a real character. I mean, he's barefoot, he's ugly, he's truculent, he's difficult. You would not want him at a party because he's constantly asking very annoying questions.
He also drinks everyone under the table.
Right, he drinks everyone under the table and then gets up early the next morning while everyone's still hungover and lying down. It's just, but if you were just to extract the propositions that Socrates puts forward in these dialogues, you wouldn't, I think, see what it looks like, for good or for ill, for that philosophy to be lived. And so what Plato is able to do, I think, in the dialogue, and I think this is true for other dialogic traditions, is dramatize philosophy as a lived practice rather than just a theoretical enterprise. And I think that view of philosophy, while it still lives on outside the university, right, with especially in religious traditions, in the university itself, it doesn't really exist. Philosophy is thought of as a object, a mode of inquiry, a dispassionate mode of inquiry that isn't really supposed to change how we live. It's just supposed to tell us truths about the world. But again, that's also, it is interesting that philosophy, as it's practiced in between philosophers, is really dialogical. So when philosophers, contemporary philosophers, or when I have my students read, for example, the Platonic Dialogues, they totally recognize what's going on there. They'll say, I mean, having a conversation with Socrates is not that dissimilar to having conversation with their teacher, right? The teacher is always pushing back, asking kind of critical questions. So that form of drama still sort of exists in the oral tradition of philosophy, Western philosophy, but not in the written tradition. But we should talk about Aristotle, because
is he the bad guy in the story?
No, I think he's the good guy, because of course, Aristotle's right after Plato in his Poetics gives a philosophical defense of the theater as a reaction against Plato. And I think it's particularly interesting because what he does is, it's not just an aesthetic defense of the beauty and aesthetic value of the theater, but it's an ethical defense, right? It's a moral defense. There's something that should be able to happen in the theater when it happens well, right? This is where we get the notion of catharsis from, that can actually be morally edifying. And so rather than corrupting, the exposure to extreme emotion and drama and tragedy can actually transform for the better the moral psyche. And actually, I mean, that's quite similar to what we see in the great Indian treatise on the performing arts, the Natya Shastra. You again have this idea of the possibility of a transcendent experience, a transcendental experience, in fact, in the theater that transports you, not just for pleasure or joy, in fact, that's supposed to be incidental, but actually for a higher ethical and epistemic purpose, a revelation of truth and the development of moral character.
No, I think that's great. The reason why I said is he the bad guy, because we have now an interesting situation where we have Plato, who denounces the theater but practices the theater, and we have Aristotle, who studies the theater and has very good things to say about it, but doesn't practice it himself.
That's very interesting.
And it's when I got interested in this sort of theatrical role component of philosophy in Platonism, I started to think, okay, so were there playwrights who also saw this and were maybe inspired by Plato to write philosophical plays? So I started to look, and I found this weird sort of underground tradition, I call it the Socrates play, that is plays that somehow feature Socrates as a character. And it was it was interesting, it was somewhat dispiriting, because Socrates is described as either a villain or a fool. And it starts with Aristophanes, with the clouds, where you have Socrates as a kind of conniving philosopher who's just after your money. And then you have this tradition that I think continues to this day of, the nutty professor, the mad scientist, the foolish philosopher on stage who's somehow in the grip of a fixed idea. So the stage life of philosophers has not been a very happy one, it seems to me.
Are there any happy, positive theatrical portrayals of philosophers?
I can't really think of one. What does that mean?
Well, maybe it just means that philosophers get what they deserve.
See, I don't know.
I mean, what do you think about... I mean, it's so clear. I mean, so much theater. I mean, we've been talking a lot about philosophy, but I mean, so much theater is... theater is so obviously philosophical, right? I mean, we can just think of... we can think about the Greek poets, and we can think about people like Aeschylus or Euripides, Sophocles. We can think about Shakespeare. We can think about Ibsen, Chekhov. We can think about a contemporary theater director like Katie Mitchell. I mean, all of these... When you go to the theater, it's so clear that these deep philosophical questions about the meaning of life, the nature of value, but also the nature of reality, representation, illusion, character, persona, all of these things are raised. And yet you are very interested in the way that theater has explicitly often, certain theatrical traditions have rejected philosophy.
Yeah. Well, I've been interested in it, but I don't endorse it. But it's true that if you go, at least to the kind of acting schools, I didn't go to acting school, but the acting schools I know in Europe and America, one of the first things you learn is that acting is really about the body, that theater is an embodied art, that you need to get out of your head, you should stop thinking, you have to start feeling, you have to be in this space with the other actors. And I'm slightly exaggerating here, but that's really sort of the ideology, I would almost say, that gets instilled in you. It's in some strange way very anti-intellectual, and there may be some good reasons for it, because it's true that theater is an embodied art form, and that also makes it maybe closer to that embodied form of philosophy that you talked about earlier, philosophy as a way of life. So maybe that's part of it, but I guess I become a little worried about it when it seems to become very anti-intellectual, and when playwrights are discouraged from dealing with, grappling with important ideas in plays because it just seems too nerdy or something like that. So I think there's sort of in the theater scene, in the theater world, there's this kind of attitude that in my mind is almost the flip side from the skepticism about the theater that you started us off with, that theater is just a place of illusion, and sort of pretense, and that the goal of philosophy is to move beyond that. So that's when I started to notice sort of this reciprocal disdain or skepticism, and I think that what we are after here is to kind of to move beyond that in some way.
So when I was an undergraduate philosophy student, and I was also writing plays, not very good ones. I mean, when I look back and I think about what was wrong with those plays, I think it was that I was too much of a philosopher. So I was putting too much philosophy in the mouths of my characters and having them, basically debate ideas on stage in a way that some playwrights do to good effect, right? So someone like Tom Stoppard or George Bernard Shaw. But when I got older, I started to think, actually, the most philosophical playwrights don't have people discussing ideas on stage. The stage itself becomes, it's not that there's an embodiment of ideas or the articulation of philosophical ideas, but rather that the play itself problematizes something deep and profound that maybe we're not actually yet capable of putting into words. And maybe that's when the theater can really step in, is to get at things of deep paradoxes and contradictions that evade easy philosophical description. But do you have more taste for the kind of more explicitly philosophical play?
Yeah, so I think I had a kind of desire to really like the drama of ideas. I mean, this is what I called this book, and this is what I was sort of hoping to find. But as I said, I only found these pretty bad plays that had nothing good to say about Socrates. And then I had to sort of grudgingly admit to, I think, exactly the position you just articulated, namely that when playwrights are trying to be too explicit about philosophy, it can be a kind of useful pedagogical exercise, but it's usually not very good philosophy. So I think I grudgingly and over a painful process had to come precisely to this position that's not where the interesting energy lies. The only other, I don't know whether that contradicts that, but I started to, so I started a theater program a little while ago, and because I had this interest in theater and philosophy, I threw some philosophical texts at these theater students. And so Plato really stuck with them. And so, for example, they did a couple of really interesting adaptations of the Symposium. Now, the Symposium is probably the most theatrical of Plato's dialogues. And so they both staged parts of it, or I also had them rewrite these speeches on love that are part of the, that competition that's at the heart of that dialogue. And that was actually really great. So maybe Plato was just better at it than anyone else. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I actually, as an undergrad, so for those of you who don't know, Plato's Symposium is a dialogue about love, and symposium actually means drinking party. Today we use it to mean like, conference or workshop, but actually it just means getting drunk with other aristocratic men. And so it takes place in a drinking party, and each each man there has to give a speech about the nature of love. And this is the dialogue that ends with Socrates drinking everyone under the table and getting up very early the next morning. Yes, and so as an undergraduate, I also took part in a symposium reading, which was very enjoyable for the participants. But we had no audience, which is interesting. So it's interesting to do theater as something that one does together, but without any kind of actual audience. Is that what happened in your case?
Essentially, yes. I think that's true. And it's interesting, there's this whole sort of avant-garde theater tradition where the audience became more and more incidental and was more about, I suppose, the self-discovery of the participants, became more like a workshop or a kind of series of exercises. And that's very interesting. Theater without an audience.
What do you think is the most philosophically interesting play?
Oh, I don't know. Well, we talked about it a little bit the other day. Among the more explicit dramatists of ideas, I think the very early Tom Stoppard is. I have a certain weakness for. Jumpers is a play that's very funny about philosophers. So it's almost like he continues that tradition of making fun of philosophers, while maybe not making fun of philosophy. Perhaps a distinction that's useful. But in the end, and this is very much along the lines of what you said, that it's probably playwright like Samuel Beckett, who doesn't really discuss ideas at all, or where you have a character, Lucky, who just kind of does a kind of parody, scrambled form of academic philosophy or science, but then there's a lot of else going on, that's probably the most interesting. Or the Greek tragedy, Sophocles.
One thing we...
what do you think?
Yeah, I shouldn't have asked that question because I don't have my own answer. But I mean, I agree, my tendency would certainly be towards those plays that don't have explicit philosophical content, because explicit philosophical content can always be removed from the theatrical context and just placed on a page.
Right.
And then I can just subject it to
Right.
philosophical scrutiny,
Right.
and it's usually not going to stand up. But what's exciting to me is when a play takes me to the limits of language or the limits of representation. And of course, it's this issue of representation, something that is at the heart of philosophical anxieties, I take it, about the theater. I mean, so Plato, for example, says that the problem with poetry and actually any kind of representational art is that it's thrice removed from reality. And so it's this removal from reality, the flight from reality, that causes anxiety to philosophers. I mean, someone like Rousseau, the French philosopher in the 18th century, he writes a treatise against the theater. And he connects the representation of the theater to political representation. And just as he doesn't believe in political representation, he thinks that's not true democracy. True democracy is when the people gather and don't elect representatives, but just engage in debate themselves and collective decision making. That has to be true democracy. Similarly, we can't have theater, because what theater does is it removes the self from the other, right? It removes the world from itself. It's a form of alienation. And he says in this argument against the theater, the building of a theater, he says, let the people be a theater unto themselves, right? Which is this very powerful notion. But it seems to me that there's a fantasy here of a kind of unmediated relationship to reality. This idea that we can just get onto pure reality without any mediating force, without anything getting in the way. But of course, as we began with, the use of the dialogue form, or even the use of metaphor, the use of myth, which you find in all philosophy, you can't get away from it, maybe tells the lie to that fantasy, right? That fantasy of a kind of pure relationship to reality, a pure kind of truth-telling.
I agree, and I think I often come to that point. Sometimes I wonder, though, whether making that point, ferreting out the contradiction or the lie here, and I think that's definitely going on, whether that's the only way to think about it. And the alternative way of thinking, and I don't have the best articulation of it, but it's something like, maybe that's the great thing about philosophy, that yes, it needs to use representation in theater and metaphor and all of that, but that it also distrusts them and has real skepticism about it and attacks it, and maybe goes overboard with the attack because it knows that it needs it anyway, but that it's a kind of self-critique or a kind of skepticism. Let's not let the metaphor run away from us. Let's not the kind of, even the theater, go overboard. Let's contain it in this form of the philosophical dialogue. So a kind of scrutiny, a self-scrutiny about these poetic means that are perhaps dangerous to be used, or that you can easily lose control over. And maybe it's not so much a blatant contradiction, but this kind of, but maybe that sounds very Protestant, so it's kind of self-critique, and maybe there's something there.
Yeah, no, I mean, this reminds me of something I say when I give lectures to my first year philosophy students. And the very first lecture I give, I talk about the pain of philosophy. I say that what really distinguishes you as a philosopher isn't being good at logic or quick at making arguments. It's really being able to kind of linger with, stay with this very particular form of pain that's produced by the philosophical enterprise. And my diagnosis of that pain, the hardness of philosophy, is precisely this. You're trying to stand outside from this view from nowhere and understand the relationship between the world and the mind. But the only tool with which you have to do that is a mind in the world. And so that's not necessarily contradictory, but it is, it has this reflective quality to it, and where that the ambition, the aspiration is one that always has to be kind of tempered by a recognition of the embodiment of ideas, right? So we're getting back to this kind of idea of the
And I wonder whether one can take this thought, it's a really great description, back to, you know, Buddhist traditions, Confucian traditions, where it's also a kind of, in the case of Confucius, a kind of withdrawal from politics, a withdrawal almost in a kind of private sphere. Of course, Buddhism, various forms of withdrawal and skepticism about representation. So there's something that seems to cut across these otherwise perhaps very different philosophical traditions around this idea.
Yes, just this ultimate, this hunger for being in touch with reality, right? I mean, I take it that that is a deep philosophical impulse. And then the second, so that's the first philosophical impulse. And then the second philosophical impulse is that being thrown back on yourself. And then the question is, what do you do at that moment? And I think the more sensible thing to do is just turn away and get on with your life. And that makes you not a philosopher, right? But if you're someone who can't look away and you are kind of addicted to the pain of contemplating that feeling of being thrown back on the self, then I think you're a philosopher. And maybe, and that's from the inside perspective, that feels like quite an extraordinary thing to be, because you feel like you're doing something really, you know, you're engaging with the most fundamental problematic of being human. But from the outside, I think you can look like a comedic fool. You can look like someone who doesn't know how to get on with life, who doesn't know how to boil a cup of tea, who doesn't know how to, you know, dress himself. I'm using actual examples of people I know when I say this. And so I think that also generates the kind of complexity of figures like Socrates, who are on one hand worshipped as godlike in certain texts, but then are also the butt of endless jokes, right? There's this kind of dual nature of the philosopher.
And that's great. And I think you're interested in the PreSocratic dialogues, and there's this Thales anecdote. I don't know whether you want to describe that. That seems to be perfect for that. Well, so it's an anecdote about presumably the first philosopher, and they're only fragments, and Thales, and there are two things that are interesting here. On the one hand, Thales walks along and falls into a ditch, and a maid sees this and laughs at Thales, who's looking at the stars and falling into the ditch. And so that's the sort of comedic, otherworldly philosopher there, right there in the beginning. But then there's the other anecdote about Thales, that he, because he knew how to observe the stars, was able to predict a drought, I think, and then he bought up all the grain and basically cornered the market on grain and struck it rich to show that, you know, if I want to, I can play your worldly game and beat you at it. So, I mean, we have the comic philosopher, we have the sort of dangerous philosopher right there.
Where should we move next?
I don't know. Maybe we should move to the audience.
Should we move to some questions, if anyone has any? Oh, lots of questions.
Okay. Woman in red in the front row.
Good evening, sir. Jeremy Bentham gives the approach of greatest happiness of the greatest number. Can we find such kind of approach in philosophy of Plato? And what is the approach of under feminism of Plato? Okay, thank you, sir.
Do you want me to take this? Okay, so such interesting questions. So Bentham and then John Stuart Mill, his follower, articulate this philosophy that we know as utilitarianism, summed up by this slogan, the greatest happiness for the greatest number. And there are many people today who are still some version of utilitarian or consequentialist. Most of my moral philosophy colleagues at Oxford are of this kind. But Plato isn't a utilitarian, and in fact, he really rejects the idea that happiness is the thing that we should be aiming for, right? And specifically for Bentham, the concern is with the presence of pleasure and the absence of pain. And Plato just thinks, well, that's a very limited understanding of what makes human life valuable. So what does make human life valuable? Well, there's a very long story, but essentially a kind of harmony between the different parts of the human psyche, the part of you that just desire, the appetite part of you that desires pleasure and wants to avoid pain, the part of you that wants status in the world, that the spirited part, and then the rational part. And the idea is that all of these different warring tendencies should come under the control of the rational part, and ideally what you will do is come to see the true nature of reality. And so really, what's the point of life? Well, it's to become a certain kind of philosopher. If that's your starting point, if you think that's what's really valuable, a philosophy that's just interested in maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain isn't just wrong-headed, it seems to be very, very simplistic. So that's the short answer to that very interesting question. I think you also wanted to know about the relevance of Plato to feminism. So that's an excellent question, given that, those are the two things I enjoy teaching most, Plato's Republic in particular, and feminist theory. Plato's hardly a feminist, but there are very interesting things he says. So he thinks that women and men should be trained alongside each other in the military arts. And they should wrestle naked. He believes in the abolition of the nuclear family, right? Something that lots of feminists in the 1970s were calling for. He believes in, but at the same time, he's very much not an egalitarian. He believes that there are people of certain types, and there are those who are born to rule and those who are born to serve. So he's not, a Marxist feminist or something like that. But I think that he's interesting in opening up the possibility of fundamentally rethinking our social and political order. And so one of the things I try to do with my students is when they read some of these feminist texts and they think, wow, this is wildly utopian, like the abolition of the family, why should I take this seriously? And I said, well, you took it seriously when you read it with me in Plato, right? And so drawing, I think, a connection where you see them, feminists often as working in the same kind of intellectual tradition and philosophical tradition of wild utopian imagining, I think that's an important connection to be drawn.
Gentleman in the front here. Gentleman in the front here.
You talked about how, in the modern times, philosophy is represented without metaphors, without theatrical representations. But if we see, at the time of French Revolution, there was Voltaire who was spreading his ideas through playwritings. Then we come on the concept of observations. We observe that writers like Sartre and Camus profess their philosophies through writing through specifically observations. Their whole fictions are based on observations. But then when we move forward, we have the problem of linguistics, what you call, you also elaborated on that, raised by Wittgenstein and Nietzsche and all. So in the modern times, we have lost that metaphorical touch, we have lost that theatricality when we move on to philosophers like Santanyana and others. So do you think that right now that we have understood its importance, there was theories of Foucault, institutions who admired the theaters but didn't worked for it, didn't wrote in metaphors. So now that we have understood it, do you think that it has lost its meaning after we have understood it?
Should I?
So you brought up a number of figures that we should have mentioned. So there's a whole history of philosophers who are also playwrights, people like Voltaire, people like Sartre, Camus, Brecht, but also someone like Terence Malick, the wonderful contemporary filmmaker who actually has a PhD in philosophy and a translator of Heidegger. So we don't mean to suggest, and we both have kind of similar, if less illustrious, theatrical credentials ourselves. But I take it that the question was about whether once you've understood what a metaphor is getting at, you can kind of can you leave it behind? So what's so interesting is that that is the kind of standard answer in analytic philosophy of language, right? That what it is to understand a metaphor is simply to understand its literal meaning, right? So it's like you have a dictionary where you look up the metaphor and then you look up what it means and you can substitute one for the other. But any poet will tell you that's not right, right? You can't, if you were to remove all of the metaphors from poetry and substitute them with their literal meaning, the poetry would not only not have the same aesthetic effect, it would not have the same meaning, because actually the whole point about a metaphor is that it's sort of irreducible, right? It's constantly doing that work of comparing two fundamentally kind of comparable things, right? Making unlikeness into likeness, and it's that, and it invites you always, I think, to dwell in the difficulties of relating one thing to another. Martin?
I think that's great, and just to add one thought that I think connects us to the discussion of Samuel Beckett before, it seems to me that when it got really interested with the existentialists was precisely when it's not the plays that Sartre and Camus themselves wrote, which are also interesting enough, but when someone like Beckett got hold of existentialism and added a heavy dose of skepticism about language, precisely that you can't reduce the metaphor to literal meanings, that language is not just a transparent tool that philosophy can wield and to get its meaning across. And that's when this, Martin Eslin, a critic, coined this term theater of the absurd for that group of playwrights in the middle of the 20th century that essentially lost faith in language, and this is sort of a consequence of a philosophical tradition. But then you couldn't just have philosophical speeches on stage. You had to really grapple with language and what it can do and what it can't do, and the extent to which you control it and you don't control it. And that's when I think you get the most interesting philosophical plays.
Right, and those plays dramatize the limits and the breakdown of language, and you can see and feel the language breaking down on stage.
The woman right next to you. Yeah, okay.
Hi. So you were talking about Plato and let the people be a theater unto themselves. So I just kind of wanted to ask you, in maybe your opinion, do you think that that the representative arts like poetry have a place in a democracy? And if you do, what would that place be, do you think?
The place of the arts in a democracy.
Me? Okay. So, absolutely. I think there's a lot that can be said, and a lot that has been said, for example, by a philosopher like Martha Nussbaum, about the deep importance of the dramatic arts, of novels, of films, to a thriving democracy. Because democracy asks something very, very difficult of us, right? It asks us to meet the other in a spirit of openness across enormous difference, right? And this is not something that just comes naturally, right? I mean, I think of, for example, the great poet of democracy, Walt Whitman, right? His work is filled with these kind of orgiastic celebrations of other people, and then there's always this moment of recoil, right? Because other people are also, well, they're hell. They're, I mean, to use Sartre's phrase. And things like novels, theater, film, can have a really important role to play in a kind of democratic civic education. But the one thing I want to say, to caveat that, is I don't think that should be the defense of art. I mean, I think art can be utterly useless, and that's great. An utterly useless, beautiful things are wonderful and they shouldn't have to be instrumentalized. They shouldn't have to be defended in terms of their value to other things we value. Because they're expressions of who we are, and their protection, the protection of the free expression of who we are, is also equally central to any kind of social, psychic, and political freedom as any other freedom that we might have. So yes, but that shouldn't be the ultimate defense.
That's great. Other questions? Gentleman right here in the front. And it's probably the last question, because we're almost out of time.
Hello. Yeah. So you talked about today's acting technique in Europe and America is almost anti-intellectual. To that point, I must quote Mikhail Chekhov's acting technique. You know Mikhail Chekhov, who inspired his acting technique from Rudolf Steiner's Eurythmy and Hindu philosophy. So when Stella Adler called him to give some lectures on acting, because he was closely related to Stanislavski in America. So at that time, he gave his lecture, and it was a very good lecture in terms of intellectual perspective. But at that time, those students didn't understand how they have to implement it.
Okay.
And that's why they did not use his technique as much they should have used. Only one part of his technique is used today also. It's psychological gesture.
Yes.
So what are your point of views on his technique?
Okay. I unfortunately, and I apologize in advance, that I'm a survivor of Rudolf Steiner. I went to a Rudolf Steiner school and did a lot of eurythmics as an adolescent, and it has damaged me considerably. So I consider it very bad. I consider it a pseudo-intellectual tradition, and I reject every part of it.
Oh, no wishy-washy answers here today. Okay, well, we coincided perfectly with the end of the session. Thanks, Martin, so much. I also just wanted to take a moment to thank all of the volunteers at the festival. I would love it. I think they've been all extraordinary. And maybe we could include them in our round of applause. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Amia.
We would like to thank Martin, Puchner, and Amia Srinivasan for this riveting session. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving them a huge round of applause. Please help us in keeping the festival venues clean and dispose of your waste in the waste bins placed across Hotel Clark's Amer. Please.